So welcome everybody. That is our last episode of our session of our fifth part long session on the Syrian war. So it's great that you are on board and that you will participate. I think more participants will join in soon. And we had, during the last sessions, we talked about the war, about the Assad regime, about the humanitarian crisis, and about Europe's role. And we thought, and the mood of all these sessions and the mood of all the experts on the panel was rather gloomy and pessimistic, the outlook they gave us. And therefore we thought maybe the last episode would be good to have a subject, a topic that is more forward-looking and hopefully more optimistic. So it's really a future-looking topic, the topic about the role of the diaspora. What role, what power can the Syrian diaspora play, in particular here in Europe? And that was the background is that at the moment a lot of Syrians are obviously living outside of the country, more than inside actually. And we are very lucky to discuss this with you, and we will see in this next one and a half hour, we will elaborate on the question, is our hope on the Syrian diaspora justified, and is it good to put it on the Syrian diaspora? And I'm very privileged to have on board with us two experts who know the field very well, and both of them are a great asset to the discussion. I'm happy to introduce to you Basma Kotmani. She is a scholar and a university professor in Paris. She is also part from the, as I understood, from the side of the civil society, a part of the negotiation process on a future Syrian constitution, which is facilitated by the UN. She's also a part of many other activities in the field of civil society. She's also co-founder of an organization that is called Global Syria. That is a platform, an initiative focused on the Syrian diaspora, and is trying to connect them and to provide leverage to them in order to contribute to a reconstruction of the Syria and the Syrian society. It's great that you're on board, Basma. Thanks for joining. And then we have with us Christine Hellberg. She's a journalist. She's a journalist, a Syrian expert, and also an author who has published at least, I think I know 3 books at least. She wrote about Syria and the Syrian people and Syrian living in Germany, but also about the Syrian conflict. She was for quite some time based in Damascus very early on, and reported, I think she was one of, if not the only German-speaking journalist for a long time living in Damascus and reporting from the country. Now she lives in Berlin, and apart from many other things that she's doing, she is currently investigating the role of the Syrian diaspora here in Germany. That's a project funded by the Mercator Foundation. So thanks for joining, and thanks for all the participants out there who join us. It's vacation time or close to vacation time. In Germany, it is actually vacation time already, but hopefully more are coming. But we are quite a number, and we will say you are very much welcomed to join the discussion. Once we have the moderated part over, you have the chance to participate either by the Q&A function or by writing your question, your comment into the chat function. That gives you the advantage that everyone who's participating can see your question. So you have both ways to participate, and you should participate. That's the spirit of this format. And now we will have a moderated discussion of maybe 30-40 minutes, and then we have the Q&A round. So, and I would like maybe I say, if you. My name is Thomas Müller-Faber. I'm from the Protestant Academy Locum. If you have not joined the other parts, so maybe that should I say. Locum is a small institution. It's a church-run dialogue platform in northern Germany, at a small village, and the idea is to do face-to-face and Chatham House rule-based discussion normally, but today even we are digital. So great that we can do this. So maybe we start now with the moderation part, and I would like to ask you, Basma, what is the Syrian diaspora after all? So we are talking more and more about it, and it's more in the news and so on, but whom we are talking about when we say Syrian diaspora? Is everyone who's out of Syria already a diaspora, part of the diaspora? So maybe can you help us to clarify the term? Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas, and thanks to the Locum Academy. I was really happy to see that you kept it going this year, as it is a very important event for Syrian civil society every year. I want to say that indeed there is a lot of ambiguity on the definition of the Syrian diaspora. And because we always say there is an old diaspora, the pre-2011, and then there is the post-2011, should we be considering the ones after 2011 as refugees, as opposed to diaspora being there from an older, longer time? I think we need to perhaps distinguish, let us say, what the numbers are as far as we can estimate. There were, before 2011, an estimated 18 million Syrians across the world. It is a big number. It's almost more than 3/4 the population of Syria before 2011, and these people are counted as Syrians since the early years of the 20th century. So they left Syria all over the 20th century. And then come these more than 6 million, probably 7 million have left because they're not all registered as refugees. And these are the ones who left after 2011. We have come to look at this panorama of Syrians in different countries and different parts of the world, and indeed they are scattered across the world. And I would say that the distinction it is not very useful if we take the chronological criterion. It doesn't help much to say it was before or after 2011. What is more helpful perhaps is a sociological definition or socioeconomic definition, which is that, and this was applied in defining the Palestinian diaspora back earlier in the middle of the 20th century, which is to say those who, among refugees, who have the capacity to develop their individual trajectories and make choices and eventually integrate into countries where they end up, where they land, can become part of a diaspora. So there is a process of diasporization, I would say, that takes place. And it has been fascinating in the case of Syria to look at those who in 2011 came out, those who had minimal skills moved on quickly. Those who had lesser skills did stay in the neighboring countries, but eventually started working and acquiring skills. Not all of them. There's always a risk of losing skills when you move out of a country, because you cannot practice your the diploma you've acquired in your homeland. That, of course, is a sad reality as well. But the fact is that we can see now, 9 years afterwards, I'm sure Christine will give us wonderful examples of that, Syrians who have integrated, who have learned the languages, acquired additional education, professional training, and are integrated into the economies and societies, maybe not at the cultural level entirely, but I think we are seeing some successes there. So if we look at the old diaspora, this is a population that is actually very well established across the world, wherever. It has a lot of wealth, and considerable wealth in some cases. It is even a dominant diaspora in countries such as Brazil, for example. It is integrated into top jobs. It has know-how, it has expertise, skills, and it has fantastic networks of relations in the places where it is. So it is a huge asset, and I'm sure we'll come to that later. This is the old diaspora, which has helped the new diaspora. We can see that in the UK. We can see it in France. I don't know how much we can see it in Germany, but we can see it in the Gulf countries, definitely. This is also an interesting pattern of how the new ones have come to join through family networks, village networks, and so on, have come to join the diaspora and go through this process of diasporization quicker than expected. So I'll leave it at that for your first question.
Maybe I could pick it up from there. I have, I think I would very much agree with Basma that a chronological definition doesn't make sense. But it's interesting because I would, rather than just look at the socio-economic definition of diaspora, I would give it a more political focus, maybe because I'm a political scientist. But I would argue that this old diaspora that you have just described very well, with all its wealth and business networks and all its activities, has not played a political role in the past. These people kind of woke up with the revolution, and they had to find out what kind of position they wanted to take towards this country, towards the regime. And many of them engaged and created very important organizations, if you look at the medical work especially. And so they have invested a lot of money for the humanitarian aid of their fellow countrymen. That's correct. But I would rather say that as the modern sociologists do when they talk about diaspora, that the very important moment of becoming a diaspora would be a minimum of initiative and activity. So it's not about the sum of Syrians who live outside their country and who still cook Syrian food and who are still connected and having cultural events, but it's really about a diaspora that comes into it comes into existence by organizing itself, by representing its interests, and by spelling out its goals, in their host communities. So only by doing so, I think the diaspora is taking shape. And this goes for the old Syrians, or the older generations of Syrians, and the new ones, the ones who came. Maybe they are not socio-economically completely integrated, but they are already very active. They are already maybe playing a quite important role because they are part of the Syrian civil society they were before. So I look, in my research now, I'm looking for Syrians who are politically active. So the common denomination between them, the people that I meet, is political commitment, be it in helping people to integrate inside Germany, be it humanitarian aid in Syria or the neighboring countries, or be it in promoting knowledge about the Syrian conflict itself. So no matter what they do, they are somehow politically engaged. So this is, for me, the definition what makes the Syrian diaspora visible.
And since you worked on because that's very interesting, on the organizational part of the Syrian diaspora here in Germany, can you maybe, Christine, give us an overview? How is the Syrian diaspora organized? And afterwards, I would probably like to ask Basman the same for maybe France or other countries. But Christine, could you?
Yes, actually, I think in the Syrian case, it's really the question how to build on a civil society to form a diaspora. How can a civil society transform or develop into a diaspora? That's an important question. And it's helpful to look into the experiences of the Syrian civil society, because the Syrian civil society is relatively young, as we know. It has emerged during this revolution. There is no independent civil society under Assad rule, and it doesn't exist by now. So this young civil society has organized itself in a very impressive way during this revolution. If you think about its resilience and its ability to work under very harsh conditions during this war and during the revolution. But at the same time, there was a problematic development, I would say, because the engagement of these people on the ground had to fit into the scheme of international donors. So this is when the international donors would ask for project plans and paperwork and transparency and accounting. So this is where professional organizations, Syrian NGOs, started to organize themselves and to fill this gap between institutions that can only spend a lot of money and the micro projects on the ground, the local councils, the activists that didn't have the management and sometimes the language skills to do so. So they served as intermediaries. They coordinated the funds between the donors and these people on the ground. And we have seen an important number of very capable NGOs that are working until now. They work in the region mainly, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in northern Iraq, some of them. And many of them have now registered in European countries to facilitate their work. So these people are active in the field of human rights, women empowerment, the documentation of crimes against humanity, war crimes, in the media work, in political awareness. So I think this is a very good basis for diaspora work. And I think some of these organizations, NGOs, would consider themselves part of a diaspora, but on the ground inside Syria, there was also a negative impact, I would argue, because you had to formalize everything. So initiatives turned into NGOs and activists turned into employees. And this process killed the engagement and the spirit, the revolutionary spirit that was felt by many Syrians in the beginning of the uprising. So I see a little bit of a problem here because you have that experience on the one hand with the process of organizing yourself, not to mention the oppositional framework over all these years, or the coalitions and forums and parties that were founded and then were abandoned and that lost their legitimacy, if they had any in the first place. So I feel that especially about young people, about young Syrians, there's a certain reluctance to organize yourself formally. They are very skeptical towards centralized and hierarchical structures out of these experiences of the last years. So they would never say that they want to represent Syrians. It would be far too large. They say, we do what we want to do on a very local, on a very basic bottom-up approach, but we don't want to start building up huge networks and organizations with committees and leaders and people who make themselves feel very important, and then we end up like 1, 2, 3 organizations before us. But nevertheless, in several European countries, Syrians have formed umbrella organizations. And the idea of these umbrella organizations is to represent different Syrian initiatives that have started their work on the ground in European countries, to coordinate between them, to do some advocacy work for them. And if we look at the countries where they've popped up, in Germany, for example, it's the Verband Deutsch-Syrischer Hilfsvereine. It's the Union of German Syrian Associations, that's what it's called in English. So it's the VDSH. They started in 2013 and they consist of 23 organizations by now. 2/3 of them were founded by first and second generation German Syrians, the people that we've talked about, the old diaspora, the old generation, and 7 of them are managed by Syrians who fled their homeland after 2011, which is interesting because they have this mix inside the organization itself. They have a lot of discussions because of these generational conflicts, and it's very interesting to follow how they try to organize themselves and become more and more professional. We have in the UK, we have the Syrian Charities and Association Network. We have in France, and Basma will know better about them, the Collectif de Développement et Secours Syrien, the CODSI, which is active in Syria with humanitarian aid and in the neighboring countries. In Sweden, we have an organization that has formalized its own existence only recently in 2019. It's called the Syrian Swedish Democratic Network. They wish to build a coherent Syrian-Swedish community. That's what they say about their own activities. And then you have the Union of Syrians Abroad that is located in Austria, but it's a unique umbrella organization with member organizations in 14 European countries. It was founded in 2011. So these different European umbrella organizations are networking together in a network called Wasl. Wasl means to connect in Arabic. So they try to gain more visibility and credibility in Europe. But if you look at the German experience, and I'm coming back to Germany now, this VDSH, the VDSH, the Union of German Syrian Associations, is among this network one of the more professional and developed organizations, but they don't represent in Germany the numerous initiatives that exist in Germany. The majority of Syrians don't even know the VDSH. So although they say that we would like to give Syrians a voice in Germany, although they have good connections to the ministries, to state institutions. So I would argue that in Germany, there is no institutionalized diaspora by now, but there are many local initiatives. Some of them do the same thing, but they don't even know about each other. They have not connected and networked in a very effective way until now. Sometimes in some places, you even have two organizations of Syrian exiled community, and they don't talk to each other because one of them has members with strong connections to the Syrian embassy in Berlin. So that's a no-go for the other organizations. So you have these complications on the ground. And I feel that the Syrian diaspora does not have a unified or consistent identity by now. I think it's fragmented. Maybe you could even say that there are different diasporas or different Syrian diaspora groups with a different self-conception even. And this self-image derives from the position towards the Assad regime, obviously, from the ethnicity. Are they Arabs or are they Kurds? To put it very bluntly, I mean, there's a big rift and there's a big split within the community between this. And it derives also from the perception of the foreign intervention powers. You know, how do you perceive Russia's role? What do you think about Iran and Hezbollah? And what do you think about Turkey's engagement in Syria? And a very simple example is that most of the Sunni Arabs consider Turkey as an ally and a supporter, whereas for Kurds, Turkey is an aggressor, and whoever works with Erdogan is considered a traitor. So this makes it very complicated. For example, last October, when we had the invasion of Turkish troops together with Syrian militias in the northeast of Syria, it was very difficult for umbrella organizations like the German VDSH to even come together and think about a statement. It was kind of impossible. So the ongoing conflict, to sum it up, very much influences the diaspora. This is what I want to say. And you cannot separate the idea of diaspora from what is going on in and around Syria.
I would like, Christine already touched a bit on this. I would like to ask you about the links that the diaspora organization have, either within the general Syrian community, but also the links into the country. Is diaspora organizations very much welcomed in Syria, or is there reluctancy to work with them?
The question calls for a complex response. Let me say first.
Indeed, sorry for that.
That is absolutely what we should be doing, definitely. So the question is very important. I think Christine is pointing to a very important aspect of the diaspora, which is the rift between those that are pro and against the Syrian regime. And both sides know very well the importance of the diaspora. So for the regime, it is a strategic target to mobilize the diaspora, to send people, talk to the diaspora. It's a major asset seen from Assad. I just wanted to point to the differences between those different organizations of the diaspora. We have a whole community of civil society, which are human rights, development, women empowerment, professional associations, and then we have political lobbying. Political lobbying does exist, and most organized in the United States, because those Syrians in the United States understood early on that any community in the US to be heard needs to be organized along ethnic national lines. The Greeks, the Armenians, everybody has been doing that, so they did it, and they have to a certain extent managed to work together to do some political lobbying, and it is interesting. It is more than interesting. It's actually effective, and we've seen some examples of how these efforts are leading to some positions taken, whether it's in Congress, whether it's by the White House, etc. I just want to say these organizations, the diaspora organizations, and funnily enough, the regime targets them as a dictatorship, but still looks to the diaspora in democratic contexts, because that's where it can really organize and prosper. Look at Jordan, very limited organization. You can't go beyond humanitarian, and even so, you cannot have free management of it. So it really needs space for free expression. Lebanon is one country where you could see cultural and artistic expression, but to thrive as a diaspora, it's democratic context. So we're really looking at Europe, US, to a certain extent, Australia has an important community today. Canada, of course, a major component. Gulf is limited to business. Now, I want to say that those who have the money, those who are wealthy among the diaspora figures and businessmen have been involved in Syria across the last 10 years. They operate, they fund, even in the worst conditions, even when it becomes impossible for donors to work, they continue to manage to find informal networks to continue supporting. And I have seen really interesting examples, even in areas where the population is moving because of bombings and so on. The diaspora is very nimble and capable of adapting because it has its own networks. And it knows the people. So never mind whether I'm funding education or funding health or funding women and so on. It's about I know these people, I know they do good work, and I know I can use them for whatever needs. And that really continues to happen, never stopped. It really is impressive that even in Idlib, when everything was frozen from donors, you would find the diaspora still operating. So it's a diaspora that is hugely committed. Many of them, in the first 2 years of the conflict, before we had massive militarization and heavy weaponry coming into the country, the first 2 years of humanitarian needs and people losing their income and livelihoods and so on, it was estimated that 80% of the support to Syrians was coming from the diaspora. 80%. That is before we had the international mobilization for the huge needs. Before it became massive, it was really, really relying a lot on the Syrians, and when it became difficult, it still relied on the Syrians in many sectors. So my hope and my belief is very strong in this diaspora. I really think it is very motivated. It is in for the long term, forever. There won't be fatigue within the diaspora. It knows the very, let's say, the difficult channels that you can follow in order to reach the population. I know from my own environment, people who are able to send money, to send help, to send, to participate in supporting whoever. A few families, a school, a hospital, that continues to be the case, and anyone who has, and I think maybe Christine, because she has done this investigation, would be able to give us figures. I don't have figures to give, or I have heard very contradictory figures of what the new diaspora, meaning the refugees who came to Europe and to Germany, for example, who are working and started being able to send remittances back home to the people they left, either inside Syria when it's possible to channel money inside Syria without having to go through the banks, of course, but to the refugee communities in the region and so on. So that connection is a very, very strong and solid one. It's amazing. Many Syrians, as Christine said, were not particularly involved with Syria. A lot had given up. Here's a dictatorship. It doesn't look like it's going to go away. 4 years, let's go on with our lives. And suddenly this hope opens and the population is out in the streets and it is calling the diaspora. Show what we're doing. Ask the media to show what we want. To help us carry our voice to the international community and so on, because they knew that left alone they would be massacred, and they still were, as we all know. So there's a strong commitment, I think, from the diaspora, which we see at the lowest and the highest level. Figures I don't have. I don't know who would have figures, but I'm very impressed with individual businessmen who set up their own organizations and said, we just go and do the work and we will continue, and teachers will not have to stop teaching, schools will be rebuilt when destroyed, etc. I find this very heartening and a real source of hope for the future.
But maybe let me ask or Basma a question, because this is about humanitarian aid, and I completely agree with Basma said. But I feel that there's a discussion among civil society organizations on how to deal with Assad's Syria in the future, because we have seen a shrinking space for whatever civil society engagement. We have Idlib that is left, where you have shrinking spaces because of jihadi networks as well on the ground. So really the big question is, can you still do workshops? Can you still work on a more political level with Syrians inside Syria? And there's a very harsh discussion going on here in Berlin between Syrians who say, we cannot, because you cannot bypass this regime. Whatever you do inside Syria, every single euro that you send there in a very good, with very good ideas and what have you, will be captured by the regime and used in their own interest, which is not in the interest of a free civil society. So this is very much the discussion. Others are saying we cannot just give up on the Syrian population inside Syria because of the regime that is taking care or using all this money that is coming in. So the big question is, how can you still operate in regime-held areas, maybe on a very low level and hidden way, without putting people in danger, without making a big political thing? Maybe it's about how to clean up your neighborhood, and this is the way you start to talk to people and to connect people and to raise awareness for other things, you know, but because it's a society in fear, you know, it's not possible to do any real political work with this regime in power. So I'm asking you, Basma, what would you say? This is there in France, is there a similar discussion? Because it's very fearful. It's going on. People are saying you cannot just forget about your countrymen in Syria. You are treating them as they are all followers of Assad, and they are not. I mean, many Syrians just stayed there because they couldn't leave, and they just make themselves as small and submissive as possible just to avoid any form of persecution. So do we try to reach out to the Syrian society inside Syria politically as well? Or do we just say, let's forget about them, we cannot bypass this regime?
No, I think you are pointing, if I may, Thomas,
Sure, absolutely.
having this bilateral directly, just to say it is a huge challenge. We know that donors are studying carefully ways of reaching the population inside the areas that have been recaptured militarily and are again under the control of the Assad regime. The challenge there is huge because, as we know, the first thing that the regime does is surveillance is back. Now, we continue to reach these people in dialogue. All of us. You can still call through Skype, through Zoom, so virtual connection is almost unhindered, almost unhindered. You have to be careful, of course, but people are having this. So we are having these very, very broad consultations with groups of women and civil society and youth across the country. That's possible. Now, if you want to send help, that's a different story, I agree. And I'm part of a group, and I might be able to send you, if you like, a first draft of the report called the Syria Resource Group. Sorry, and the discussion is about how can you tell donors to work through alternative channels to those of the Assad regime, including for humanitarian aid. Because, you know, if humanitarian aid cannot be conditioned, you know, cannot be subject to conditions, as humanitarians always tell us, if it doesn't respect non-discrimination, if it doesn't respect transparency and equal distribution, we have a problem. And that's what a lot of groups are actually pushing for, talking to governments, talking to the European Union in particular, and we had the Brussels conference a few 2 weeks ago, and that's to say, go local and go small. It is better to give $10,000 euros to a community rather than 100,000 through the Assad regime. People will appreciate rebuilding and recovering gradually, even if they don't get everything they need right away, even if it takes a bit longer. If they see improvements, they will mobilize and do it. Now, for that, we need to have a real political discussion and authorization to do that. When we look at the cross-border, the fight to have a cross-border aid resolution renewed, we know it's going to be very tough. At the same time, I think the only the leverage that particularly European countries as well as the US have is we have the money, but we want to decide who we give it to. And this is a discussion maybe to have, not so much with Assad, because he's not going to hear that, but maybe with Russia, and say, pressure the regime. We need those channels to operate. We need to use the local business community, the local private sector that's still there. Local NGOs international NGOs have to be able to work with Syrian workers directly without the regime vetting these workers and choosing the ones it wants and diverting those resources. So go local and go small has been the message, but it does, as you rightly point, you cannot do it without some form of opening at the formal level, at the official level. But I think this discussion is the Europeans should be standing their position, holding on to their position and saying there will be no funding. Of course, humanitarian is difficult to do with conditions, but this is not a condition. This is about reaching the right people, reaching the beneficiaries and the needy people. Now that applies also for the diaspora. If that opening happens, but it has to be negotiated by governments. So I agree with you. There still is a possibility to send some support, but that is obviously reduced today, especially with the collapse of the Syrian pound. You can't even now, send dollars, euros, and hope that people will receive a decent amount in Syria. The loss is too high, and people are just telling us, don't send anything, don't hold it for a while until, otherwise this money is wasted. So yes, we have a big problem. We have an urgent problem there, and it has to be negotiated by governments. I agree.
We touched already a bit about it. Now we talked quite some time about aid and humanitarian aspects. But what about the lobbying thing in Western, in particular in European countries, that the diaspora could do? You mentioned the example, Basma, of the United States, but how is the lobbying activities of the diaspora, the leverages it has by lobbying here in Western and European countries, and how much impact would you say can diaspora networks initiatives have in European countries? Maybe both of you, German example, France example, Basma or Christine, who wants to go first?
You go first, Basma, on that, because you're part of
what
it.
I can say is maybe about France and a little bit about the UK. To my knowledge, there is no real organized lobbying or groups that lobby, simply because the political systems are not organized in the way it is in the United States. It is more the work of influential individuals. Sometimes 5 of them would come together because, you know, they weigh in the business community in the country. They have connections at a high level with government. They do work on parliaments and on the executive, on the governments. But these are individuals who do that, some groups, okay? We have a powerful, or maybe more organized lobbying by the Kurdish communities. That is effective. They've even opened offices in many countries, and this has become actually an impressive network of voices and organized structures. Apart from that, I know of individual initiatives, very influential, but individual, not yet organized, not structured. Very good structured in terms of humanitarian, as Christine pointed out, actually. Yes, there are federated efforts in the UK and in France, for example, but when it comes to the political aspects, it's not quite that.
Yes, I would actually say the same concerning Germany, and the Kurdish networks in Germany are probably even more powerful because they have a long history in political work. We have to not forget about this. They didn't start in 2011, they started in the 80s and 90s to become active. And concerning Turkey, and with our huge Turkish community in Germany, there is really a very vivid Kurdish lobby scene. That's correct. I would completely agree with this. We don't have a political effective lobbying from the Syrian side on Germany's policy institutions. We have the Foreign Office that is here and there inviting Syrian diaspora figures or organizations to listen to their needs, to listen to what they have to say. That's good. There are connections, there are personal relationships, but it's not that they would influence policy processes really inside Germany. But this brings me actually to the questions: what is the Syrian diaspora really able to achieve, and where are its limits? Because if we look at what they do, I mean, we have tackled some of this, but I would identify 4 kinds of activities that the Syrian diaspora is busy with, which is first the humanitarian aid that we have mentioned now several times, you know, which is supporting IDPs inside Syria, supporting refugees in the neighboring countries by providing them with food, shelter, education, medical care. The second field is integration efforts. So it's about supporting Syrian individuals to take root in Germany in the field of education, integration, employment, and their legal status. You know, there's legal consulting, for example, for Syrian refugees. The third activities, or the third way of working as a diaspora, is raising awareness among the German society for the conflict. This is very important for a lot of activists who have come here during the revolution to say that we want to explain what did we start in 2011. You know, this is completely forgotten by the German society. So we have to explain and we have to educate people and the public in Germany about the roots of the conflict and its consequences. This is the third big activity. And the fourth one goes in this direction of political lobbying. It's political campaigns and political work on topics that at the same time concern German policy and the daily life and the situation of the Syrians living in Germany. For example, you have the conference of the federal interior ministers that meet every half a year to discuss whether they want to extend they have a stop of sending Syrians back to Syria. So they are discussing every 6 months whether Syria is safe enough to send, for example, Syrian criminals back home. So this is interesting because really you have Syrian NGOs and Syrian activists who go there, who organize themselves and who would advocate for the fact that Syria is not safe. You know, there's a political campaign going on. People would go there, talk to several of these interior ministers and, you know, advocate for their own cause. They would go as well to the trial that is going on in Koblenz now against intelligence officers that have been involved in systematic torture and mass murder. So there is a connection between German policy and what concerns the Syrians, and there is the beginning, I would say, of this political work and political campaigning, which is very interesting. And I think that all of this is very valuable, and I don't want to underestimate this, and I think every single person has an impact, you know, what they do with their personal engagement. But talking to many Syrians in Germany, I feel that there's a problem, a general problem with networking and with an open exchange of ideas and with practical cooperation. And I think this has to do with the situation in Syria, with the historic reality in Syria and with the current conflict, because it's 50 years of dictatorship that have left their mark. You know, there is no political discourse in Syria, there is no culture of debate, there's no way to think freely, to talk openly, and there is very little political awareness. So you have, usually political work is being personalized, you know, you have individuals who dominate the engagement instead of structures that are being developed independent of people. And in addition to this historic problems that have been inherited, because it's a country of 50 years, it's half a century of dictatorship. In addition to this, you have the war at home that is still ongoing and that is poisoning. I feel it's really poisoning the living together and the coexistence in Europe outside Syria, because this conflict has not ended. The crimes are ongoing. There's no feeling of justice. There won't be any reconciliation without the feeling of justice. Sometimes there is a generalized hatred, I feel, against parts of the Syrian society that is perceived as hostile. You know, you have, in the case of Germany, you have victims and perpetrators who've come here. You know, they stayed in the same accommodation in Berlin, Marienfelde. If you think about Anwar al-Bunni, the lawyer, and Anwar Aslan, who now stands trial because of his crimes as an intelligence officer. They shared the same accommodation. So it's really difficult because in Syria you have intelligence officers who meet the relatives of victims, you have Islamist fighters who meet members of the Syrian army, you have opposition members who meet regime supporters, and this is very diverse and very complicated, I feel. And I think that the many attempts that we have seen to bring Syrians together, in Lokom, even, and Basma has mentioned it, this was very important and very valuable, you know, these conferences that you held and giving the space to Syrians just to meet. So I feel that the conflict cannot be excluded. You know, you cannot just say, you know, now that we're all here, let's forget about the past, let's forget about the conflict, let's just work together. This does not work, you know. I feel that only Syrians with a similar political opinion or Syrians with a very pronounced political awareness are able to work together at that point. You know, they have to agree on a common denominator, like a minimal consensus, for example, that they would not engage with regime agencies or ministries or authorities or something else. They would have to find their own definition of what they're supposed to do together. And only then they can work together. So what we see in Germany is you have parallel networks instead of a unified diaspora structure. Maybe you don't even need a unified structure. I'm not saying this is good or bad, but it's parallel networks more. And this obviously reduces the effectiveness of the Syrian diaspora in addressing European policymakers or addressing even the European societies, you know, to advocate for their common interests. So this is a problem that I see at the moment.
I see. Interesting. Maybe we should slowly come to an end with the moderation part and get the... oh, yeah, Basma, please.
If I may just add one thing, which Christine alluded in the very beginning, and we should bring it back because it's part of reality, and that is that the absence of a coherent opposition, political opposition, is also an important factor in the scattered efforts of the civil society. Because as you know, in Locum, civil society groups are just looking at this opposition and are very critical. And they are right, because there are a lot of weaknesses and diversity that is not well managed within the political opposition. That is also preventing the actual organized political lobbying, perhaps. I think that's part of it. When we launched this initiative, Global Syria, it was about diaspora. The first thing we hit was, oh, are we putting out a statement that talks about Assad's future? Half was saying no, the other half was saying we should be clear about it. Are we gray? Are we here? Are we there? No, we are clearly for a democratic Syria. And then the choice was, we talk about recovery, we talk about Syrian civil society, it is our focus, but the point was this diaspora, because there is no coherent political opposition, might well be the kind of strategic interlocutor for the international community, because it has wealth, know-how, networks, can really play a role, but it needs to come together to become a strong player. And that, I think, the time is becoming ripe for this kind of approach. We're not quite there yet.
It's very good, because that was my question leading to the discussion, because during all these talks we had, that's the fifth talk of our series, all experts said at one point with different words, but they all said, well, we need in the end in Europe a shift from a Syrian policy approach to a Syrians policy approach. We put the Syrian people first. So the question that came to my mind was, is this diaspora focus leading us to a general policy approach which puts people first instead of regime or players or powers? So what's your take? Maybe that's the last question I want to ask. Basma, you already said is to come, but
okay. Well, then maybe I would add the following. I think the solution, the actual settlement, is going to come from an internationally agreed direction for a transition in Syria, and hopefully it will be towards democratic transition. The day that happens, it is actually not going to be produced by the Syrians themselves. We know how internationalized the conflict has become, and therefore the settlement is likely to be as well. The moment there is a direction set, my belief is that a lot of Syrians will start working together better. Okay, I don't want to be too optimistic and idealistic, but I think a course will be set. At the moment, everyone is hanging in the air and saying, which direction is this going to go? Including for the diaspora, who doesn't want to be political, but is very committed to the recovery of the country. So it will be for Syrians. I am sure that the diaspora, yes, it can be sectarian. Yes, it can look to Christians, helping Christians only, Islamist groups helping Sunnis only. You do have some of those, but more often in Europe in particular, you find a more secular or more ecumenic, let's say, ecumenical diaspora, which is saying all communities. We talk to Syrians across the board, and the point is, this is not about it's not a civil conflict, it's not a sectarian conflict, it is about dictatorship and moving towards democracy, and therefore it has to be addressed to all communities, wherever they fought, on whatever side they fought.
I agree on your last point, but I very much disagree on what you said first, because I really consider it a waste of time to think about political transition and reforms and whatever. I feel that the European politicians have just wasted time and effort. They have not understood how to play an important role in this conflict. So this is why I come back to this idea from the Syria policy to the Syrians policy. I think it's a very tempting approach, because if you look at the conflict itself and the fact that Assad will just stay in power with this regime and all this brutal means of oppression, any European politician cannot work with this regime from this point of view. So they try to avoid the complexity of a Syria policy by focusing on the Syrians abroad. And that's easier for them. And it's not a bad idea in general. But I think that we really have to understand that you cannot separate Syria from the Syrians. There is no Syria without Syrians. And you cannot think of the Syrians without taking into consideration what's happening in and around Syria. So the diaspora is not thinkable without the Syrian conflict. I said this before. So what does it mean if Europe now wants to transform its policy to a Syrian's policy? I would agree that this is a good idea if you focus on the Syrian society instead of talking in vain about this political transition that you have just mentioned, Basma. I'm sorry to say that. And I would very much argue that if you want to put the Syrian society at the center of your new policy, then don't forget the Syrians inside the country, and we've talked about this, there are more Syrians outside than inside the country, but I think it's very important not to split this society even more. There is already this big rift going on, but this is why it's even more important to think the Syrian society as one and not as a separated one. So the most important thing for me is content. What do you want to, what's your policy approach then? How do you want to serve the Syrian society? So you have to think about what does the Syrian society want and what will help them, or what does it need? So I feel that there are certain skills that will be helpful in the work of the diaspora and that are important for unifying even more, organizing Europe even more effectively. And these capabilities can be learned in Europe because you have the space for it. You have a freedom of expression. You can learn how to work together. So I think it's basically three kinds of skills. It's communication skills, how to express your opinion without devaluating the other's opinion, how to learn that political dissent is fine, not violent communication. You don't have to take everything personally when somebody's criticizing you. So this would be the kind of skills that can be learned for the people who have come recently, especially. And then how to find common subjects. What is it that you want to work on? How does democracy function? How does the rule of law function in European countries? This is maybe how to build federal structures. Look at Germany on the local and the state and the federal levels, and what would be an opportunity to cooperate and to advocate there for your own cause. And then the third skill would be organization, defining goals, working effectively together, delegating tasks, creating structures that work independently of individuals. I've mentioned this before, forming networks. I think these are things and skills that would be important for the Syrian diaspora. And I feel that a lot of Syrians are interested in this. And it's happening already, actually. In Germany, this is happening. There are some programs that are organized by Syrian organizations that are financed by different German government institutions. And there is a big interest from the Syrian side. So what Europe should do basically is provide the space for the Syrians, to meet and talk openly, to put all their prejudice on the table, to really get to know each other in the first place and think about what kind of ideologies they have to get rid of. And I feel this would help without interfering too much from the European side, but just giving a space, maybe a moderation, and then the Syrians to help them just to find out what would make them even stronger and how they could work together more effectively in the subjects that really are important to them.
Okay, thank you very much. I think with that point, we should look to the participants who wrote us a couple of questions already, and I would like to elaborate a bit on them. Maybe we first touch on questions. I like to cluster a bit the question that we get to make them more organized. The third cluster I would like to address to the internal structure of the Syrian diaspora. And one person, Rainer Lucht, asked us, what is the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood within the diaspora? Is there an influence? Do they play a role, and what ideas of the future they have? And another person wrote us something about the Christians, with relatively the same question: what role does Orthodox Christians play within the diaspora? So maybe could you, on the different fractions of the diaspora, elaborate a bit? Who wants to go first?
Basma.
Basma, okay.
Okay, I can say a few words. Let me say I am part of neither that group nor that group, so neither group. I'm not in those networks. I know them a little bit. They tend to function in a closed manner. They're not very much out there. They're not very visible. They don't communicate so much. They have their own channels and are discreet and effective. Yes, of course, there are important networks for the Muslim Brothers. They operate mainly now out of Turkey, mainly, not exclusively, but to a large extent out of Turkey. And we're talking about Muslim Brothers, not more radical Islamist movements or Salafis, because at some point we had some support coming from the Gulf countries for these movements. I think this has been reduced, not entirely finished, but it's there in a to a lesser extent. Muslim Brothers in Turkey, proximity, support, a friendly environment in Turkey itself to be able to send to people inside Syria. The region of Idlib is a conservative region. They have their influence, I think, although certainly not dominant, but they do exist, particularly in that area. And they've had those networks from before 2011. Okay, they're very effective. But I would not be able to tell you how effective they are at the moment. I know they are. That's one thing. About the role of the Syrian Orthodox Church, there is a rift there. A large part of it has supported, is used by the regime to advocate for the regime, to go out and speak in favor of the regime. And some of the clerics are accepting to take on this role or being forced to take on this role, who knows. And that's a problematic issue for the Christian communities themselves, because we should never forget that the Christians really wanted and were hoping to remain outside the conflict. They didn't want to take positions. A majority of them said, this is not our fight. We are not choosing to defend a dictatorship, nor are we going to go for particularly a militarized resistance. And therefore, it wanted to stay out. It wasn't able to stay entirely out. So Christians tend to be more and more the ones saying, we don't want to have anything to do with this. Like the rest of Syrian society, this is not viable. The current situation is unbearable. The Syrians have suffered. But basically, yes, there is, of course, important, very, very powerful networks to organize the departure of Christians from Syria. And they are being welcomed and even encouraged to emigrate. Who would blame them? Who can blame them? Anyone wants to escape from Syria if they have a chance, because it's unbearable. But these have been helped more by Christian networks and churches across the world. This has been very effective. So I would say this is a major contribution of the not just the Orthodox Church, but all churches have worked on this. And maybe I should leave it at that for lack of time.
I would just add one little thing, because actually there's not much to add, but I was thinking of the charity work. And we should separate this from the political work, because you have obviously religiously motivated charity work from all kinds of sides. You have Islamic Relief, you have big NGOs who do a very important humanitarian aid work, and you have the churches obviously offering this kind of aid to communities, and not only their Christian brothers and not only the Muslim fellow brothers, So this is important to not misunderstand whatever an organization does that has in its name the word Islamic or Christian, that do not misunderstand this as some kind of political lobbying in the opposition. What you've just mentioned, Basma, goes very much for the opposition networks. Actually, the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood is very important in Turkey. I completely agree on that. But let's just make it clear that even in Europe, and we are organized by Evangelische Akademie Locum, so this is organized by the church. So we are, this event is sponsored by a German church. So just to make it clear that it doesn't mean that it's bad in the first place whenever it comes to, the kind of organization that has this religious touch, maybe to put it that way. But what is very interesting is that I feel and I hear a lot about NGOs or even governments thinking about bypassing the regime with humanitarian aid, and people who think about how to do this think about the churches inside Syria as a partner. Because we have, in Germany, we have large NGO networks like the Diakonie and others, Brot für die Welt, who have worked for decades with other churches and Christian networks in the countries that they are supposed to help in. So they feel that maybe through their long-standing contacts inside Syria, they can bypass the regime by working with local church communities, which is difficult because, as Basma just has mentioned, they are all being corrupted by the regime. Any cleric or everybody who has a position, be it the Mufti of Syria or be it a patriarch of a church, is being agreed upon by the Mukhabarat, by the Syrian Secret Service. So it's complicated, but maybe it would be interesting to find out how much you can find other channels to Syria through going, for example, with the help of local churches or communities, Christian communities.
Okay, thank you. One question for the internal structure of the diaspora, and then I would like to move on to another cluster of questions. One person has asked, she's interested in knowing more about the links between the diaspora people active in humanitarian objectives and those active in civil political engagement for Syria's future. So you already touched in your discussion, the moderated discussion, we touched about it, but maybe is there difficulties and links? How would you answer this?
I could just maybe say to make it very quick, I feel that there is an ongoing discussion in Germany within this umbrella group that I've just mentioned, the VDSH, between exactly these kind of organizations. The people who have started with humanitarian aid, they want to be as neutral as possible. They don't want to give political statements. They want to stay out of the political conflict as much as possible. And you have the younger generation organizations, mostly consisting of activists who are political in the first place. And this is why they started their activities in the beginning. So this is creating a problem, because if you want to become the voice of Syrians inside Germany, then what do you put in your statement? I mentioned the Turkish invasion last October, which was very complicated because they couldn't really agree on a wording. You can obviously make a statement saying that, yes, we are in favor of democracy and any kind of foreign intervention is not positive, but that's about it. So this is not really a political statement that would be valuable and helpful for the German community. So I feel that there is a problem within this diaspora between people who want to keep it very much humanitarian and between others who want to be more political, outspoken.
Okay, maybe two questions that are very broad, and one person asked, why after 10 years of conflict is there still not, when is the time ripe that the diaspora in the end will unite? Another person asked, when is it possible, how is it possible that Syrians meet and come together and have a common ground when they are so polarized? So that's a very broad, two very broad question about the general, but maybe very fundamental. Is there something to say to that? Basma.
Yes, here's my experience with diaspora people who are very involved. They have been working throughout the conflict. When you tell them, the time has come because the needs of Syrians are changing. You can't just do humanitarian, because humanitarian is largely taken care of by the international community, and Syrians now need other things, and to recover, they they will need ABC, and all of that. If you put your resources together, your knowledge together, if you come together and work together, you will be more than just the sum of your parts. It'll be a real strategic difference, and you will weigh differently. The answer has been they're comfortable continuing to work through the institutions and networks they have established. So there is some, not reluctance, but hesitation. What's the added value of working with others? I think, to be honest, is that the moment recovery becomes in the agenda of the international community, recognized, because we are currently inhibited and blocked in this conversation by sanctions and no reconstruction without transition, and the position of a number of countries. And as you know, those countries that were tempted to go ahead alone and open up relations with the regime have not been able to do so. So the channels are blocked at the moment, largely. So these people and the diaspora do not feel that there is the sea change that they should see and say, aha, now is the time when we need to. So the momentum doesn't exist. And I think Christine I may have not well expressed what I meant to say. First of all, international intervention to reach a settlement. By that I mean mainly the United States and Russia coming to an agreement about where Syria should be sitting in the regional equation. That's when you open space for regional powers either to pressure them or to get their cooperation and so on. So I think it has to come from outside. It's not going to come from inside. But the moment we have this kind, believe me, the mobilization of the diaspora is very impressive. Very. And at this particular moment, I know of so many groups who are saying, now is the time to think of what is a good team to head the transition, how many people from the regime and how much from the opposition, and what's the economic, military and security arms of this transitional structures and so on. It's quite impressive that they want to get ready to go whenever that signal is given. So I think we can expect the diaspora to move, but that signal hasn't come yet. And it's difficult to convince them, but they are organizing. I think they will be ready and they'll come together at that particular moment.
But that's plain theory by now. That's the problem. Yes, but I would argue in a different manner. Maybe this is actually to finish a little bit, or to wrap up the question. You know, where this diaspora could lead to. I would argue that yes, I agree that Syrians should get ready, you know, for any kind of change. I think we have to think on the long run. I think it will take probably a generation or two to reconciliate and to come together, because this conflict has to be settled first in the sense that, you know, some kind of justice is being felt, so people could really forget what happened to them, to their personally, to their personal stories. But what is needed, I think, is, and this is very impressive for me when I talk to young activists, is that they say, you know, the revolution has started or has turned into a new phase. You know, and this new phase means that every single Syrian has to overcome the authoritarian thinking that is implemented or embedded in him, from the moment that he was born inside Syria. Because it's an authoritarian system, not only a political system, but the whole society is working along authoritarian logic, you know, inside the families, inside the neighborhood, in your job, in the schools. So it's a very important process to stop this. And only if you start to live democratic values in your own family, in the relationship with your wife and with your husband, in educating your children in a different manner, then will you be able to reach a democratic political structure someday. You know, this will eventually lead to a democracy on a state level. And this is something that very much impressed me, this self-reflection of the personal values and ideals of these people. And it reminds me very much, and this is always, I always like to get back to this, to Raed Fares, this very famous activist, Raed Fares in Idlib, who once said that there is, in every Syrian, there is a little Assad. So you have to overcome this little Assad first in order to build a democratic society, and then a state of law that would consist of citizens and not of submissive subjects and obedient subjects. So this is very much what could give us hope in the future, that people would start to work on themselves from the bottom to the top, not waiting for some political settlement from outside, which will come from outside, I agree, and Russia is the one who's holding the strings. I completely agree with Basma. But in the meantime, not just wait, but start to work and to get ready for this kind of democratic values and this life and dignity, actually, that this revolution was all about in the very beginning.
Okay, thank you very much. We should really come to an end soon. And I still have 3 questions out. Maybe we can very briefly answer them, because 2 we can cluster together, and then come to wrap up. 2 persons asked from different perspectives. They asked with different words. What role does the constitutional committee play for the diaspora? Does the diaspora has a role in there, and how's the state of the constitutional committee? Basma, I think that should go to you, that question.
Yes, the Constitutional Committee is constituted, as you know. It took 2 years to put together. It includes members of the diaspora. It includes some prominent legal experts, lawyers and judges who are from the old diaspora and new diaspora across the world and in the region. I would say on the opposition side and civil society side, a majority are outside today, outside the country. This is because, opposition cannot survive inside, and they wouldn't be able to come and go freely. Civil society on the opposition part of it, those who are close to the revolutionary ideas or democratic ideas, they are mostly also now outside the country. The Constitutional Committee is not making a lot of progress. It still is not something you can really say, here's a political process happening. If it does move ahead, I think that it will ignite more interest from the diaspora altogether. At the moment, nobody sees it as carrying momentum and ability to move the process forward. So I'm afraid this is not a very encouraging answer, but that's the reality of it.
Maybe one final question about legitimacy and organizational process. So one person asked, why not organizing election among the diaspora organization and having some sort of election process and legitimacy, as for example was done in Hong Kong. So, very forward-looking question, but
yeah.
Okay. Or
I'll say a word about this. I think this is a very interesting question. It's not going to happen that easily, but I think we should be. We shouldn't dismiss it completely, because Hong Kong, yes, interesting, and the Chinese diaspora is an incredibly inspiring example for any diaspora, really. But the Palestinians organized as well the diaspora and had a structure, a parliament, basically, that represented Palestinians across the world. And after all, it did federate the Palestinians across the world and connect them together. They had unions represented there, women's groups represented, everybody was represented from outside, of course. That's where the PLO was. So it has these structures. I hope our conflict doesn't last that long for us to have to organize something like this. But I think eventually, if it were the case, Christine is right. We have to look at the long term, and that's where we will have to have structures that maintain those links over the long term. I agree.
You want to add something to that?
No, I have nothing to add to that. Thanks. No.
Okay, maybe I'll ask the final wrap-up question. it has to do with imagination. The late New York Times correspondent Anthony Shadi once said that Syria and the Syrian conflict is to very much to a lot of extent an ability, or reflects an ability of imagination. So what do you wish we would imagine in the future when it comes to Syria? So what should be should come true in our imagination on Syria? So what's your imagination for the future?
I think maybe I can start with this, just with a few thoughts of my conversations with Syrians in Germany, because I think that, I mean, Syria is not the first and will not be the last country that has experienced decades of dictatorship and surveillance and humiliation and fear and corruption, you know. So other countries have overcome this. And I think sometimes it helps if you look back in history in countries like Germany, for example. I mean, Germany was in ruins in 1945, in 1946, after the Second World War. You had so many refugees spread all over the country. And then look at East Germany. Look at the fact that you had 40 years of socialist one-party doctrine there. You know, and I know that there are many differences between East Germany and the Syrian situation, but there are similar experiences if it comes to the Stasi, for example, especially the German Staatssicherheit and the Syrian Mukhabarat. I mean, they were even taught, the German Stasi taught the Syrian agents some torture and surveillance techniques and methods. So in Germany, all of this is over. You know, we've overcome this, although there's still a long way to go when it comes to citizenships and your self-imagination of a democratic country and what that means to the coexisting with other people. We see this right now. But for example, in Berlin, you can go and visit a former Stasi prison that was turned into a museum, and to serve, you know, the documentation of injustice and oppression. And I know Syrians who go there and they felt very much inspired, because they feel this, now they know what they have to do in the future, you know, how to really handle this kind of history that once they hope, obviously, that they will overcome. So I think this could be inspiring to look at European experiences with this. And as a lot of this diaspora is living in European countries, it would be helpful to look at the European history, where European states have fought each other for centuries, you know, how they build up this kind of peaceful coexistence in the European Union. So this could be inspiring for some Syrians. And then I maybe go back to this idea of getting ready by starting to be democratic in your own family, in your own house, and to build it really bottom up, to be able to, or to deserve this kind of democratic statehood once you are practicing this in your own surrounding, you know. And this is always very much inspiring me when activists tell me, now forget about politics, forget about state structures, forget about all of this, we have to start now. And our generation has really to learn how to live together with respecting each other, and you know, without this authoritarian patriarchal thinking that has very much influenced the Syrian society and is still influencing it until now.
Basma is back. Can you hear us?
I can hear you again, sorry.
Okay, so it was perfect timing. Christine was just ending her speech on that, but maybe you can
to be honest, yeah, I did not hear your own quotes of the New York Times correspondent, Shadid. So I can't react to that. So I just want to say, I think the approach of speaking of Syrian diaspora brings us indeed to talk about Syrian society. And this has been lacking. I have experienced this particularly in the political process of negotiations in Geneva. They talk about regime, government, opposition, you know, armed groups, and the state and its institutions. And then once I said, can we talk about Syrian society? And that word was never mentioned. So I think diaspora is that mirror or that echo, or that can carry the voice of a society and force the international community. Europeans are better than others, but still, because they do put their efforts into civil society. Yet we have a temptation to say it's so much easier to deal with one player who can deliver. Well, two players who can deliver, okay, then it's going to be the regime and the opposition, and that just leaves the society outside. A large majority of society has done fantastic things during this conflict, and that needs to be recognized and supported. And all means of supporting, we are using virtual means today. Go ahead with virtual means all the way for education, for dialogues, for federating efforts, and so on. Keep Syrians connected, that's major, and how we can reach them has to be negotiated in terms of supporting them effectively. I'm sorry if this is not quite in line with what you wanted to hear.
Oh, that's perfect. That's a perfect final words.
Okay.
So we take this as our mission for the years to come, to work on that line. So thank you very much. Thank you both of you, and thank you to the participants out there. That was our last episode, and we will have I think maybe in 1 week or something the chance to look on to the video documentation we are doing at the moment. So thank you very much to everybody, and that is the end of the episode, and I wish you all
Thank you very much.
Thank you very nice evening.
Thank you
very much.
You too.
Bye-bye.